The brief for this high-level panel discussion number 2 is unpacking health concerns in the oil and gas sector. So what I have done is to look at the questions that were listed, and it's going to be a trick for the panelists because I have departed and restated the questions. So if you're a good Kenyan student and you're basically giving the exam, this is not going to work, because then we have to think on your feet, because I have reformulated the questions a little bit. So if you went through the questions and tried to draft your answers, they're not completely off what we should discuss, but I've just kind of reframed them a little bit. But let me say that what we need to think about is across the entire value chain of the oil sector, what kinds of risks are we dealing with? And more specifically, to what extent are these risks health related? And to what extent also do we have sufficient understanding to actually profile those risks across those sectors, across those points in the oil field development, which is from exploration to decommissioning. So how do we start to think about risks along that spectrum, but how do you also think about interrelated and path-dependent risks that are also in many ways triggered but exacerbated by the fact that they're part of the whole chain? So how do we think in complex ways rather than in linear ways around these risks? And what we mean by health, is it just humans? Or are we also talking about environmental health? Or are we also talking about environmental health in its totality, talk about plants, soil, and animals, and therefore people? So we need to think in much more sophisticated ways about how we frame this risk understanding. And also think about how do we make sure that our interventions are risk-based, that they're informed by how we understand and interpret risk, so that we're not kind of blindsided by being more reactive, but we can actually start to anticipate this. One of the panelists in the previous session said it's very difficult to actually regulate what you don't know, but we just can't sit until the problems come to our doorstep to actually then figure out what we want to talk about. So here's how I want to start this, and I'll give you panelists kind of an opportunity to make very brief opening statements about this question of what are the health risks associated with oil and gas operations from the point of exploration to decommissioning. How do you understand those risks? What are they in terms of kind of, and then what I would also invite you is to then use your disciplinary lens where you're coming from to actually then kind of weigh into that. Where do you see these going? And I'll start with Ghulam.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me share some of the experience that I've had in petroleum refinery. Now, petroleum refining is midstream. The oil and gas industry is split into downstream because the downstream sector has got various risks which may be different from midstream. From midstream, we move from upstream, midstream to downstream. I would now like to share with you my views on another sector that we have, and that is us who use the petroleum fuels. Okay? In marketing, they say the end user is very important. The end user is me and you, the people who drive and the people who get driven, the people who are in industry who use the fossil fuels. Downstream, the risks are quite clear. Downstream are the risk of drilling the oil, the chemical fluids that are used. That's the problem they have in Turkana. You have the risk of an oil well bursting, like you had in the Gulf of Mexico. What really happened is that oil was being drilled under the sea, and a valve burst open, and there was a lot of oil which spilled and polluted the Gulf of Mexico, and the effects of the pollution we are still seeing. An interesting question was posed by our moderator: what is health? Are we talking about human health or wider? Now, human beings are what we eat, if you would allow me to say that. So plant health is equally important. When we had the Kibesi oil spill, one of the first things that we did together with ERC is to stop consumption, sale and consumption of crops from the contaminated farms. That was a precautionary measure. Also, animals. Yeah? We had problems with animals who had taken up contaminated water. So I think when we look at human health, we have to look at in a holistic way, because we get impacted by what we eat. We get impacted also by what we breathe. And we all know that fossil fuels cause atmospheric pollution. Yeah? The end use of fossil fuels is just one. We combust them. Now, petroleum is combusted, oil is combusted, gas is combusted. And you will not get the energy out of it until you burn it. And when you burn it, you get emissions to the atmosphere. But we have always heard what goes down, what is spilled, goes up. Yeah? That is, we have been told since our school days. What is spilled will always go up, meaning evaporation process will take over and you will get a contamination of the atmosphere. But let us also appreciate, and I want to share this, what gets spilled, what goes down even further. It goes down right to the groundwater. And we have experience about this in Mombasa. We have experience about this in Kibesi. And let us not forget, in places like Mombasa, people use borehole water. Not only for washing, some people also drink it. When you contaminate the groundwater, borehole water is contaminated. Yeah? And that is, you are contaminating the water livelihood of people. And that is quite serious. And imagine if there's a mosque nearby, a church nearby, they have a borehole. They do the boreholes as a public service. How do you go to the sheikh or to the priest and tell him to announce to his people, don't use our borehole? It is contaminated. Yeah, the mosque or the church does not offer any protection against contamination. How do you tell the people not to drink that water? How do you tell the people not to use that water? So there are impacts on health which come from whatever we use, from the borehole water, from groundwater, from the plants that we consume, because plants get contaminated, from the soil and water, from the animals who pasture on contaminated grasses, and also from the atmosphere. Atmospheric pollution is much talked about. When we burn fossil fuels, we have to talk about the nitrogen oxide, the sulfur oxides, and now we have to talk about the carbon oxides. Why? Because of global warming, which contaminate. And all contaminants lead to health problems. And I would like to share with you, although we may not appreciate it, a study has been done, several studies I believe have been done for the Nairobi atmosphere. And the Nairobi atmosphere is almost contaminated. I mean, we are not as contaminated as Delhi or Calcutta, but we are approaching borderline to a contaminated atmosphere. Yeah, let me pass on to my colleague.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Dr. Kimani. Now, I'll answer Dr. Witi's question from an occupational health perspective, not the wider environmental health, because that's my area in occupational medicine. Now, for us, from the occupational health perspective, there are very many health risks, and the best way to look at them is to classify the oil and gas sector into the upstream, midstream, and downstream. So on the upstream side, when you're doing exploration, you're exposed to most of these areas where there is oil and gas tend to be remote, geographically isolated areas. So when the people doing the exploration go there, they're exposed to very many hazards. And we can unpackage them in many ways, but the classical one is they're exposed to certain biological hazards, wild animals. In Turkana, there are a lot of scorpions. You get a scorpion sting out there, it can cause death very easily. They are poisonous snakes. So the people who do the bush clearing, the site clearing, I think the Talo gentleman shared with us the sites before and after they have decommissioned. When they're doing the bush clearing, you're exposed to these biological hazards, the wild animals, poisonous. Then you are exposed to the harsh environmental temperatures or climate. High temperatures, Turkana doesn't have a lot of very high humidity unlike the coastal region. So for Lamu, they would be exposed to high temperatures and also the high humidity. But Turkana, the humidity is a bit better, but the temperatures are very high. We call those physical hazards. Then as you're doing the drilling, you are working in confined spaces. The workers have to keep on adding the drill bits and the pipes. They're exposed to what we call ergonomic hazards. You have to carry heavy loads. Those drill bits, some of them weigh a lot. Then you have to use abnormal working positions, which bring wear and tear to what we call the musculoskeletal system. So they'll be exposed to aches and pains. Then you're going to use certain chemicals, or as you drill, there are certain, they call it the drill mud. It contains a lot of chemicals. So you're also exposed to those chemical hazards as you do the drilling. Then when you get to where you want and you, like in this case, you extract and do the piloting, this crude oil also has a lot of chemicals. The main ones are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which we know are associated with many human health concerns. Key among them, and I'm not causing panic, is of course a lot of them are known cancer-causing agents. They cause different forms of cancers. When you inhale the fumes, they cause also respiratory diseases. Then when you handle them with your bare hands, they cause what we call irritant contact dermatitis. Let's just simplify, call it a skin disease. So the product, once you extract it, has to be handled in a certain manner. Otherwise, the workers who are handling it will be at risk of developing these diseases. Then, of course, after production, when production is done, and when you're decommissioning, the same set of hazards will also apply in rivers. Now, when we come to the midstream, this is the transporting, refining stage. The hazards are mainly chemical because now the product has already been extracted from the ground. So in the refining process, as you're getting the various distillates and components of the crude oil, the workers are exposed to chemical hazards, also ergonomic hazards, physical hazards, and biological not so much, because normally it is refined in a well-resourced and urban area, place with infrastructure, because you need a lot of energy to refine it. Then at the downstream end, which is the retail now, at the pump station or the gas refilling station, the main problems are the same, chemical hazards. The product is a chemical. So workers need to be aware so that they protect themselves from getting these problems. So for me, those are the main health risks, but as I said, mainly from a human health, occupational health perspective, not the environmental. And then before I hand over, I just wanted to define health from the World Health Organization perspective. And health is defined as not just the mere absence of disease. Let me repeat that. Health is not just the mere absence of disease, but it is a complete physical, mental, social, religious, and intellectual well-being of an individual. So a lot of people in the world confine health to just the absence of disease. Some go further. In Kenya, we say uzima wa mwili, denoting physical well-being. But we forget the other types of well-being, and especially social well-being. So please, as we move on in this discussion, remember the World Health Organization definition of health is that health is not just the mere absence of disease, but is the complete physical, religious, mental, social, and intellectual well-being, so that it captures health, human health in its entirety. Thank you.
So my name is Lillian. I work with controlled risks. So as the name implies, I will assess this question from a threat and risk perspective. For any situation, you must initially have an assessment, like I'm sure one was done a long time ago in Kapese. They did a threat assessment and they raised the risks. So one of the risks we have is to the environmental health and safety. My premise is always to come from a point of compliance. Once you know the risks, how are you going to avoid this risk, mitigate it, or are you going to have to deal with it? So we know, for example, as the other panelist has says, there are scorpions. We know there are scorpions because we did an assessment. We saw they're there. What do we want to do about them? Do we avoid them? No, because the area of operation is what it is. So we deal with it. This means we develop protocols. So these protocols are us mitigating the risk. So we train. We're speaking about, we're talking about people. The person that you are expecting to work in these hazards, you need to assess their psychosocial situation. Camp life is demanding. I have colleagues who work away for 6 weeks and are home for 2 weeks. Is this person healthy? This is the person who's going to deal with every other thing the camp raises. A next step in compliance and also in threat and risk is understanding international best practice and whether it is relevant to you. We have mosquitoes, yes. What is the best practice for mosquitoes? Is that practice relevant to you who's based in Lokicha? Is there room for you to integrate best practice with local content? The people who live there have been there for ages. What have they been doing? Will it work for you? Does their medication work for you, or will you have a reaction and have to be taken out of camp? So I push for a holistic overview of environmental health and safety because the message will not be uniform. The mitigation factors for safety upstream are different from midstream and then from downstream. So are we constantly auditing? Are you checking yourself? Is the one thing I can guarantee, like we know, is change. Have you braced for change? Are you resilient enough to brace for legislative change? If what you're doing last year will change this year according to legislation, are you then now out of practice? Is it illegal what you're doing? Are you ready? Are you always ready? Therefore, to remain ready, you must constantly check your threats and your risks and use those to make sure you're always compliant.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is, almost afternoon. Huh? My name is James Campbell, working with ESF Consultants. We are normally engaged in environmental and social management consulting in upstream. We've been in midstream and to a small extent downstream. Now, will I say the agony of talking last is that you're left with very little to say because the rest of the people have said. I shouldn't have said that. Yeah, so basically I'm looking at this from a point of origination in terms of impact assessment. Before anything is done, what are we looking at? What do we find out in terms of health? And then how do you pick that on throughout the process of the cycle? I mean, the various attributes and aspects of health have been discussed quite a bit. Maybe the points or the areas that were not maybe touched on much is offshore. Offshore is peculiar, it is treacherous, it is dangerous, depending on the weather conditions. It is also mentally straining if, for example, you're supposed to be on a platform or a seismic ship for 2 or 3 months or 6 weeks and then get back to. So you can imagine you're in this small platform and you will be there for the next, say, 30 days or so. without much interaction other than with a group of people until you go back. So those are some of the things that you will encounter there. Safety of transportation from shore to the platform, landing, say, a chopper on a platform in windy conditions to either rescue someone from that platform or to bring in medical aid or such. So there are impacts that will not be defined by the fact that it is a petroleum sector, but just that of the intensity of those activities within that sector. You have a campsite with, say, 1,000 people. They're all moving stuff every day. They're rigging out in, you know. So that's potential for injury. It's potential for loss of life. It's potential for mental disturbance, I would say. But you also have, and now this is more looking at the chemical side of it, the products, the oil itself. What impacts does it have to the people working in those areas or the communities living around? And you know, looking at contamination, looking at air pollution, looking at noise pollution, and things like that. So there's, and safety of movement of equipment and other stuff is also some of the health implications of that sector. So for me, an important, and I think the first discussion in the morning to do with impact assessment and public participation and how you have that working applies also for health and safety. You know, while you're looking at the health implications, safety implications of an activity, how do you package that into the management plan? From the management plan, how do you unpack that into activity, actual activity during the process? How do you implement those things that have been captured as mitigation measures for risks? Yeah, and I think that is where, you know, things start falling through the crevasses. Yeah, and maybe we'll discuss that slightly more. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's pretty interesting, you know, from how these things might happen further downstream from spillages and how they get into the food chain, how our environment, the air we breathe, the food we eat gets contaminated, to just the sheer facts around occupational risks and hazards, the environments where people work, the heat, the physical risks that we're exposed to, the chemical hazards, etc. And just the fact that these are huge operations that move tons of masses of either soil or material. But I think one of the things that we also need to think about is we are creating cities, we are creating townships. Somebody in the previous session talked about sexual and reproductive health. If you've been up to Lodwar, you've been to Lokichar. If you're in Lokichar 15 years ago, it didn't look like it looks today. The composition of people there, the diversity of people there, didn't look like it looks today. If you look at the vegetation around Lokichar as well, it's changed. Some invasive plants have arrived in that place that have come through trucks and etc. Charcoal trade is now huge. Families are getting dislocated. From here, many months up in Turkana, as Lillian said, you're living in a camp, the stress and all of that. We need to think about all these things.
Tangu talo walikuja Turkana, kuna vifaa ambayo wanafanyia chemicals kama tangi, makaratasi nyeusi na mipira. Na ukiona hiyo makaratasi watu wanatumia na ni chemical. Je, umefanya awareness kwa public?
From occupational health and safety, how can we say that a process leads to somebody getting cancer? How long does that, you know, period take? Because like yesterday you had some of us talking about cancer. So I just want to know, like, you know, how long does from exposure?
The health of the ecosystem has an impact on the human health. So as we discuss health and safety, let's not look at just the health and safety of the people, but the health and safety of the ecosystem, because it also has an impact on the health and safety of the people themselves.
Then your external lifestyle, your non-working lifestyle also affects your health. And these were young people, and in Mombasa, the beach clubs is an outlet. It's an outlet to let out your frustration. And the beach clubs are very noisy. In fact, I once told the Occupational Health officer in Mombasa, he should visit the beach clubs and measure the noise, and it will be beyond 80 decibels. It will probably be around 90 to 100 decibels. The beach club music is too loud. 90 decibel is like loud music. And an airplane landing is like 120 decibels. So you can just imagine what it will use when every weekend you have got high noise into your ears. So we investigated that, and we found out that it was not workplace, but it was external to the workplace. So there's a bit of counseling, the doctor talked to him, but then the medical examination rules, and doctor is here, they are actually, they give you the basic foundation. But the medical examination rules should also be detailed to tell you what to do when you find a problem. In this case, we found a hearing loss problem. So the best thing to do is we took them away from a plant function to an office-based function. Why? The plant function is where you have noise, where you must wear your ear protection. But as a precautionary measure, in case people have a habit like specs, yeah, you often find the specs, the safety goggles, people wear them on their forehead instead of on their eyes. I think you have seen them, Dr. When you make audits, the inspectors catch them. They're saying you are wearing your safety goggles to protect your eyes, not to protect your forehead. So that's what happens with the ear protection. These are earmuffs, which are supposed to be worn on the ears, and more often than not, you find them on top of the head. So we removed them from a plant function to an office function. And people thought we had promoted them. We had not. We had just moved them from where they could be exposed to a place where there was no exposure. So there are actions which industry can take.
Now, from the Directorate of Occupational Safety and Health, as came out yesterday when Mr. Muruka presented, we deal with what we call the workplace environment, or as our colleagues from NEMA call that, the four walls where workers are working. So from the workers' perspective, as DOSH, we regulate any waste that is generated or hazardous substance generated or handled or used within a workplace. There are laws, there are guidelines. And it's one of the 13 subsidiary legislation, legal notice number 60 of 2007. We also call it the Hazardous Substances Control Rules. So there are detailed mechanisms that any employer should put in place in order to protect the health and safety of the workers. So those policies, guidelines are there, and we enforce them. Then, once you get out of the four walls of the workplace, NEMA kicks in. They have their waste regulation guidelines. So those are there. Number two, you asked about compensation. If workers are exposed to hazardous substances in their workplace, and as a result of that exposure, they develop what we call occupational diseases. Now, there's a group of diseases we call occupational diseases. And these are the diseases you get directly as a result of exposure to workplace hazards. And these are different. In Kenya, we are used to what we call infectious diseases, malaria and others. But there is a specific group of diseases we call occupational diseases. So if you're exposed to this workplace hazard and you develop an occupational disease, then there's another law that we enforce called the Work Injury Benefits Act that kicks in to compensate you. But if it's for the community, I think NEMA is a better place to answer that. Are there compensation mechanisms for the community? Oof, there were many. Mental health, the definition of health, that's why I defined it. Health is not just the mere absence of disease, but it is a complete physical, mental, social, religious, and intellectual well-being. So a good occupational safety and health, or a good occupational health and safety program, will also capture mental health. Most people call it stress management. So workplaces with a proactive occupational safety and health management system will also have a program for stress management. This captures mental health. They will also have a program for what we call them workplace wellness programs to teach people on life, what are they called, life skills. How do you interact with other significant members of society? And the basic unit of society is your nuclear family. So how do men and women interact, husband, wife? How do you interact with your children? So that should also be captured because it's a very important part of mental health. Then our gentleman at the back mentioned about not transferring these hazards to their families at home. The Occupational Safety and Health Act is very clear. The best way of managing or controlling any workplace hazards is under something we call the hierarchy of controlling hazards. You aim to eliminate. That should be the gold standard. Any hazard you identify in workplaces, you should always aim to eliminate it. If there is any technology, process, anywhere in the world that has been able to eliminate that hazard, you implement it. If there is none, then you move to the second level, which is not as good as elimination, which is you reduce the hazards that the workers are being exposed to as low as reasonably possible, using international best practices again, and there are many ways you can do it. For example, if it is a very hazardous chemical you're handling in the workplace, can you substitute this very hazardous chemical for one that is less hazardous, which will enable the process flow to continue? If it is a high noise machine, can you engineer or re-engineer this machine so that the noise levels come down to within internationally acceptable limits? Then the workers who have to use PPEs in the workplace. OSHA 2007 is very clear. PPEs should only be used in the workplace. They should never leave the workplace. You should have storage space to use your safety shoes, your safety gear. You come from home in your home clothes, change, put your safety gear, go to work. Then in the evening, you reverse the process. And depending with the risk assessment, some of these hazards will require you to be decontaminated. You have to shower and then change into your home clothes and go home. And that has been put in place so that we don't expose our other environments outside of the workplace to these workplace hazards.
Madam Chief, umeniuliza swali, takujibu during lunch. Nataka kukuintroduce to someone who will listen to you, yeah? Okay? That's okay. Hakuna mwingine aliniuliza swali?
Okay, I'll speak briefly just about generally what has been raised. Nitamjibu yule kidogo. We of course encountered each other, tulikutana kwenye baraza za stakeholder consultations. Na umetoa jambo la muhimu sana. Washikadau wakija kwenye mikutano, sema wavuvi, siku yao imepotea, hawajaenda kuvua. Kisha masaa ya kurejea nyumbani, hakuna some allowance ile ya kucushion how for that lost day. Now kuna masuala mawili ama matatu ambayo lazima pia tutazame kwa sasa hivi ndio tupate maybe a proper direction on what happens in that case. Most listed companies, zile kampuni utapata ziko kwenye London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, na ni wana sheria ambazo ni kali sana, especially kuhusu bribery, either bribery ya government official, bribery ya community members, bribery ya enforcers. Kwa hivyo hawataki hata kidogo kupatikana in a situation ambayo inaweza onekana kama a bribery attempt. Ndio wameleta watu hapa wakawanulia chakula wakaweka kwenye hoteli. Unajua vile watu complain ati MCA walipelekwa Mombasa, walikuwa naenda kushuhudia ama kuzungumza mambo ya uvutaji wa sigara, wakarudi wakasema sigara sawa tu, tutaangalia mwaka ujao. Sisemi walisema hivyo, lakini mfano huo, sio? So ni kujaribu kuavoid situations kama hizo. So at the moment hatuna clear direction. Wakati ambao una mradi wa that scale, hiyo ambao ni mkubwa, ambao pengine una serikali ndani yake. Je, nani atawakusanya washikadau kutoka kila mahali waje watoe maoni yao, yachukuliwe na waweze kutolewa kule ambao wanatoka na kurudishwa kama inahitajika? Hakuna. Lakini naye ule project proposer, sheria yake kutoka kule atokako mpaka hapo haimruhusu kuonekana akipeana pesa. Nao mimi ni consultant hapa kando, si mshahara uwe usiwe sawa, lakini sina any authority ya kusema hawa basi wapewe pesa waende kule ambapo wanataka kwenda, waona. Kwa hivyo lakini watu kama ama idara kama NEMA pengine wangeangalia where we have community meetings, how are those communities facilitated to get there. Our jamii watafikaje kwenye mikutano, na iwe ni something that is legislated, iko kwenye sheria, so mtu akifanya asiambiwe ulifanya something against the law. Just one before you tumemaliza hapo. Now the other thing about, and which I tend to feel about this discussion with regards to health and safety, the oil sector, one shoe doesn't fit all. I think the most important thing is the process through which identification and management of those risks is done, okay? So that you have a clear process from the very beginning and thresholds that are clearly understood. Today, if your XY company that doesn't need to report to anyone outside with those instructions, you don't need to do some of the things that some of the larger oil companies do on a daily, day-to-day instance, you know, measuring of pollutants or emissions that you have on a daily basis. If there's noise, are you measuring noise on a daily basis? If you're asked to retract those documents, do you have them? How do you ensure that the HSC plan is being followed through and through? You're only able to do that through monitoring. So you can tell at this particular point, we're going above board, at this particular point, we're going down. And then the other thing is that then what in-house measures, what Bwana was talking about, what is the organic structure inside that gives you the confidence that health impacts are being addressed? Do we have someone in charge of HSC at a high function that is able to call out decisions? If you have someone working at heights and he has what you call a lanyard and maybe he's dropped off, he's dangling, what is the procedure of getting that person out of that place? And who needs to make that call and how accessible are they? So that we don't maybe give prescriptive solutions for isolated cases that are being mentioned here, but rather give solutions to a process that, if applied, can work for each and every sector, not alone the oil and gas one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.